April 1942, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. A senior staff officer spread reconnaissance photos across the polished table. Images of American positions scattered across the Pacific, Port Moresby still holding, Australia untouched, isolated garrisons clinging to islands that should have fallen months ago. He laughed, a sharp bark that echoed off the walls. MacArthur sits in Melbourne giving speeches, while his forces are cut off by thousands of miles. Washington sends him nothing. No carriers, no divisions, just words. They've abandoned the Pacific to focus on Europe. The American theater commander has been reduced to a beggar with an empty bowl. He tapped the map, where New Guinea's jungles sprawled green and hostile. He threatens to retake the Philippines with what? Australians and leftovers? The Southwest Pacific is ours. Their supreme commander commands only his own irrelevance. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What that officer didn't know was that Douglas MacArthur, fuming in his Melbourne headquarters with rage that could melt steel, was about to prove that strategic brilliance could compensate for resources Washington refused to send, that the beggar would forge an offensive with cast-off ships, green troops, and captured Japanese barges that would slash through the Empire's southern perimeter faster than anyone thought possible, and that his furious conviction that the Joint Chiefs were making a catastrophic mistake by starving the Pacific Theater would drive an island-hopping campaign so aggressive, so unorthodox, so brutally effective that it would reconquer 1,500 miles in 18 months, while the enemy wondered how it was even possible. MacArthur's fury was rational, justified by mathematics. In 1942, 85% of American military production flowed to Europe and the Mediterranean. Of the remaining 15% designated for the Pacific, most went to Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Command, the Navy's show, carrier task forces, and Marine divisions striking across the broad ocean toward Japan. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Theater got the scraps. 7 infantry divisions when he needed 20. No carriers when he needed air superiority. A handful of B-17 bombers when he needed hundreds. Supply shipments that arrived 3 months late, if they arrived at all. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff who'd evacuated MacArthur from Corregidor and awarded him the Medal of Honor, essentially told him to hold Australia and wait. MacArthur read the directive, crumpled it, and began planning an offensive. The plan was insane by conventional standards. New Guinea, one of the world's largest islands, blanketed in jungles so thick maps showed it as blank green, defended by battle-hardened Japanese troops who'd conquered half of Asia, would become MacArthur's highway to the Philippines. He would advance up the northern coast, seizing airfields and harbors in leapfrogging bounds, bypassing strongpoints to let them wither, using air power to substitute for the naval strength Washington wouldn't give him. Each jump would extend American airfields forward, bringing more of New Guinea under fighter cover, allowing the next jump. It required perfect coordination between ground, air, and naval forces. It required taking jungle airstrips and making them operational within days. It required betting everything on speed and surprise, because prolonged battles would consume resources he didn't have. Washington thought he was delusional. The Joint Chiefs saw New Guinea as a worthless backwater, malaria-infested hell where divisions would vanish into jungle fighting an enemy that owned the terrain. They wanted MacArthur to defend, not attack. They wanted him to wait until 1944 or 1945, when Europe was won and resources could shift Pacific. MacArthur sent cables dripping with contempt, arguing that abandoning the initiative would let Japan fortify the entire Pacific, that every month of delay cost years of eventual war, that the Southwest Pacific route was shorter and more supportable than Nimitz's island hopping through Micronesia. Marshall read the cables, understood MacArthur's fury, and still sent the resources to Europe. The calculus was brutal. Germany was the primary threat. Japan could wait. MacArthur would have to make do. So MacArthur made do with weapons and methods that made conventional planners cringe. The PT boat became his substitute navy. 80-foot plywood speedboats armed with torpedoes and machine guns, fast enough to dodge destroyers, shallow-drafted enough to operate in coastal waters where Japanese ships couldn't follow. They carried supplies to isolated outposts, evacuated wounded. raided enemy barges, and occasionally torpedoed larger vessels in night attacks that relied on speed and surprise over armor. Each boat had 3 Packard V, 12 engines producing 4,500 total horsepower, pushing 41 knots in calm water, burning 100 gallons per hour, giving them a combat radius measured in hours, not days. They were fragile. A single shell could punch through the plywood hull, but there were dozens of them, built quickly in American boat yards and shipped disassembled to Australia, crewed by young officers who learned to navigate reefs in darkness and attack shipping convoys that outweighed them 1,000 to 1. The Douglas C-47 transport became his logistics backbone, the unglamorous workhorse that made every offensive possible. 2 Pratt & Whitney are 1830 radial engines, 1,200 horsepower each, cruising at 160 miles per hour, carrying 3 tons of cargo or 28 soldiers, able to land on grass strips carved from jungle. MacArthur's engineers would seize a Japanese airfield, repair it under fire, and within 48 hours C-47s would be landing with ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements. The Japanese couldn't understand how American forces kept advancing when their supply lines ran through hostile territory. The answer was always air power. Transport planes flying over jungle that would take weeks to traverse on foot, delivering in hours what would take convoys days. But the weapon that defined MacArthur's campaign was the one Washington actually gave him in numbers: the infantry rifle squad. The M1 Garand rifle became the great equalizer in jungle warfare, where engagements happened at 30 yards in choking vegetation where you couldn't see the enemy until he was close enough to kill. 8 rounds of .30-06 in an en-bloc clip, semi-automatic fire. A rifleman could empty his weapon in seconds and reload in 2. Sustained rate of fire that simply overwhelmed Japanese bolt-action rifles. The Garand weighed 9.5 pounds, kicked like a mule, and the distinctive ping of the ejecting empty clip became a sound Japanese soldiers learned to dread. American infantry squads built tactics around it. A Browning automatic rifle for sustained fire, riflemen with Garands for volume. Everyone trained to maneuver and shoot, to advance under fire rather than dig in. The training that forged those squads was brutal, compressed, and focused entirely on the realities of jungle combat. American divisions arrived in Australia expecting to fight a conventional war and discovered that conventional tactics died in the first 100 yards of jungle. Early patrols got ambushed, units got separated, men died from heat exhaustion and infected wounds and malaria before they ever saw the enemy. The 32nd Infantry Division's first action, Buna in late 1942, became a nightmare of frontal assaults against fortified bunkers hidden in jungle, American soldiers dying in the mud, while MacArthur screamed at commanders to attack faster. 7,000 American casualties to take a single strongpoint. Lessons learned in blood about what worked and what didn't. What worked was combined arms at the smallest level. Infantry didn't advance in waves. They infiltrated, using every depression and tree as cover, suppressing bunkers with rifle fire, while flamethrower teams crawled close enough to burn them out. Artillery was less useful in jungle where you couldn't see targets, so MacArthur's forces learned to call in air strikes instead, teaching pilots to drop bombs and napalm danger close, trusting that friendly troops would mark positions with colored smoke. The Navy's few cruisers and destroyers became mobile artillery, standing offshore and firing into the jungle at coordinates radioed by spotters, naval gunfire that shook the earth and sent shrapnel screaming through trees. A young lieutenant named George, fresh from officer candidate school, learned the doctrine from a grizzled sergeant at a training camp outside Brisbane. The Japs own the jungle, the sergeant said, until we bring so much firepower they can't survive it. You don't clear jungle. You burn it, bomb it, shell it until nothing's alive. Then you walk through. And you move fast, because the moment you stop, malaria and rot will kill you faster than bullets. George nodded, took those words into the Markham Valley Offensive in September 1943, and watched them prove true. The Markham Valley jump showed MacArthur's method crystallizing into doctrine. La, a Japanese stronghold on New Guinea's northern coast, sat at the mouth of a valley leading inland. Conventional assault would mean landing on beaches under fire, fighting through prepared positions, losing thousands of men. Instead, MacArthur dropped an entire paratrooper regiment, 1,700 men of the 503rd Parachute Infantry, into the valley 20 miles inland, seizing an abandoned airstrip called Nadzab in hours. C-47 transports immediately began landing with artillery and supplies, while Australian divisions advanced up the coast and American forces pushed from the south. The Japanese garrison at La, suddenly facing encirclement, retreated into the mountains and died there. 3,500 killed. The stronghold taken in 2 weeks. Allied casualties under 500. George's company was part of the force that linked up with the paratroopers, marching through jungle that steamed in the tropical heat, uniforms rotting off their backs, boots disintegrating from constant moisture. They heard the enemy before they saw them. Crack of rifle fire from undergrowth, screams in Japanese, then silence. George's squad returned fire, Garand's hammering, the bar gunner hosing the vegetation, grenades tossed blindly into thick cover. They found 3 bodies afterward, Japanese soldiers who dug spider holes and tried to ambush the column. Good initiative, poor execution, the sergeant said, nudging a corpse with his boot. They fight hard, but they're starving. Notice the ribs showing? That's what happens when we cut their supply lines. That observation, the enemy was starving, became the central insight of MacArthur's campaign. Every Japanese garrison in New Guinea depended on supply convoys from Rabaul, the massive base in New Britain where the Empire had concentrated air and naval power. Cut those convoys and the garrisons withered, unable to replace losses, unable to feed their troops, reduced to eating jungle plants and dying of malnutrition. MacArthur's air commander, General George Kenney, took that mission personally, forging a tactical innovation that would define Southwest Pacific air power. Kenney inherited a hodgepodge air force, obsolete P-39 and P-40 fighters that couldn't match Japanese Zeros at altitude, B-17 bombers too valuable to risk on shipping strikes, B-25 medium bombers that couldn't hit moving ships from high altitude. He solved the problem by turning the B-25 into a gunship, removing the bombardier's compartment and installing 8.50 caliber machine guns in the nose, teaching pilots to attack at masthead height, strafing and bombing simultaneously. The tactic, called skip bombing, involved roaring in 50 feet off the water, dropping bombs that skipped across the surface into the ship's hull, then raking the decks with machine gun fire as you passed. It was suicidal in theory, devastatingly effective in practice. March 1943. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved the concept with a slaughter that stunned both sides. A Japanese convoy, 8 transports carrying 7,000 troops, 8 destroyers escorting, left Rabaul heading for La, hoping to reinforce the garrison before MacArthur could strike. Kenney's bombers found them in the strait, waves of B-25s and Australian Beaufighters attacking in coordinated strikes that turned the sea into chaos. Skip bombs punched through hulls below the waterline. Machine guns shredded lifeboats and survivors in the water. The convoy disintegrated in hours. All 8 transports sunk, for destroyers lost. 3,000 Japanese dead, including most of the troops meant for La. American losses, 5 aircraft, 13 crew. A Japanese destroyer captain, one of the few who survived, wrote in his report, "The American bombers came in waves, too low for our anti-aircraft guns to depress. They ignored our fire completely, flying through it as if it meant nothing, and their machine guns swept our decks while bombs exploded along our hulls. In 30 minutes, we went from confident to sinking. I have faced American air power before, but never like this. They have learned to kill ships without needing torpedoes or high-level bombing. This is a new kind of warfare, and we have no defense." MacArthur read that report, intelligence intercepted and translated within days, and smiled his rare cold smile. The isolation strategy was working. Every convoy sunk meant garrisons that couldn't be reinforced, couldn't be supplied, would collapse when American forces arrived. The theater he'd been given with nothing was becoming a meat grinder for Japanese shipping and aviation, killing experienced crews and replacing them with nothing while American production poured in replacements faster than losses. The aircraft that gave MacArthur air superiority arrived in numbers through 1943, transforming Kenney's Air Force from desperation improvisation to overwhelming power. The P-38 Lightning, twin-boom, twin-engine fighter, with tricycle landing gear and a nose full of weapons, became the workhorse of the Southwest Pacific, perfect for the long overwater missions where single-engine fighters risked ditching if the engine failed. 2 Allison V. 1710 engines producing 3,200 combined horsepower, top speed 390 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, combat radius 450 miles with drop tanks. The weapon upgrades that marked American industrial innovation appeared steadily, each improvement bought with combat lessons. The M1 Garand got a jungle variant with better moisture seals and corrosion-resistant finishes. The M1 Carbine gave officers and support troops a compact semi-automatic replacing pistols. The BAR got a bipod that made suppressive fire actually accurate. The P-38 got improved engines. The P-38J model with V. 1710-89 engines, producing 1,500 horsepower each. Dive flaps that let pilots follow targets down without compressibility issues that had plagued earlier models. The B-25 progressed from skip bomber to gunship to the H model with 14.50 caliber machine guns, a flying battery that could shred ground targets, and shipping with equal efficiency. But the decisive upgrade was invisible to the enemy: radar. American ships and aircraft carried increasingly sophisticated radar sets that let them navigate in darkness, find targets in clouds, coordinate strikes without visual contact. The night fighting that had favored Japanese forces, whose pilots trained for low-light operations, became an American advantage once radar-equipped P-61 Black Widow night fighters arrived in theater. Twin-engine, jet black paint scheme, SCR. 720 radar in the nose that could track targets at 5 miles, 420mm cannons, and 4.50 caliber machine guns in a dorsal turret. The Black Widow hunted in darkness that grounded other aircraft, vectored by ground controllers to intercept Japanese bombers attempting night raids, killing them before they reached targets. A Japanese bomber pilot, interrogated after being shot down by a P-61 in May 1944, expressed bewilderment. "We saw nothing. No searchlights, no visible fighters. Then tracers from the darkness. Our wing exploded. We crashed into the sea. How do you fight an enemy that sees in the dark?" The answer, radar-directed interception, was technology Japan couldn't match. American industry produced millions of vacuum tubes, thousands of radar sets, trained thousands of operators and technicians, deployed the systems across the theater faster than Japanese intelligence could track. MacArthur's relationship with the Joint Chiefs remained contentious, his cables to Washington filled with barely contained fury at resource allocation he considered criminally incompetent. In July 1944, he flew to Hawaii for a conference with Roosevelt and Nimitz, the meeting where strategy for the final approach to Japan would be decided. Nimitz wanted to bypass the Philippines entirely, strike directly at Formosa and then the Japanese home islands, arguing that the Philippines were strategically unnecessary. MacArthur argued with religious fervor that America had a moral obligation to liberate the Philippines, that abandoning 17 million Filipinos who'd suffered under brutal Japanese occupation would be an eternal stain on American honor, that the Philippine Islands offered better airfields and logistics bases than Formosa's rugged terrain. He won the argument, partly through moral force, partly through strategic logic, partly because Roosevelt, facing re-election, understood the political value of fulfilling MacArthur's famous promise: "I shall return." The Philippines would be liberated, MacArthur would command the operation, and Nimitz's fleet would support him. The decision unified the Pacific offensives, gave MacArthur the resources he'd been screaming for since 1942, and set the stage for the largest naval battles in history. The Leyte Gulf invasion in October 1944 was everything MacArthur's New Guinea campaign wasn't: massive, conventional, supported by overwhelming naval power. 7th Fleet put 200,000 troops ashore in the first week, covered by Nimitz's 3rd Fleet carriers, whose aircraft dominated the skies. The Japanese Navy committed everything in a desperate counterattack for separate task forces converging on Leyte Gulf, hoping to destroy the invasion fleet and collapse the beachhead. What followed was 4 days of naval battles across 1,000 miles of ocean, carrier strikes and surface gun duels and kamikaze attacks, American forces fighting with advantages in radar, damage control, pilot quality, and industrial depth that made the outcome inevitable despite tactical surprises. The Battle of Leyte Gulf annihilated Japanese naval air power. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships destroyed, including the super battleship Musashi, 73,000 tons, 18-inch guns, pride of the Imperial Navy, sent to the bottom by 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits, so tough it took 5 hours to sink. American aircraft kept striking in waves, coordinated attacks that overwhelmed defenses, pilots who trained for years executing textbook approaches, while Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fought with courage and died in their mounts. When Musashi finally rolled over and sank, taking over 1,000 men with it, the Japanese surface fleet's offensive capability died with it. A Japanese staff officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters wrote in his diary after receiving reports, "We committed everything and achieved nothing. The Americans absorbed our attacks, repaired damage overnight, and continued operations as if we had not hurt them. Their replacement pilots fly as skillfully as our veterans. Their ships damaged today return to service tomorrow. How do you defeat an enemy that replaces losses faster than you can inflict them? This is not war, it is industrial slaughter, and we are on the wrong end of the equation." That equation, American production versus Japanese attrition, had been running since 1942, and by late 1944 the numbers were catastrophic for Japan. The United States had built 24 fleet carriers, over 100 escort carriers, dozens of battleships and cruisers, hundreds of destroyers and submarines. Japanese shipyards had replaced a fraction of their losses, building in months what American yards completed in weeks. American pilot training schools graduated 8,000 pilots monthly, each with 300 hours of flight time. Japanese training had collapsed to 60 hours, then 40, finally just enough to take off and land. Kamikaze pilots didn't need advanced skills, just enough competence to hit a ship once. MacArthur's ground forces in the Philippines fought a campaign that mixed the jungle tactics of New Guinea with urban warfare in Manila and conventional battles across Luzon's Central Plain. The M4 Sherman tank, derided as inferior throughout the European War, proved perfectly adequate against Japanese armor that topped out at the medium Chiha tank with a 47mm gun that couldn't penetrate Sherman frontal armor. American tank platoons could advance in the open, absorbing anti-tank gun fire, while infantry cleared positions, tactics that would get them killed against Panthers, but worked fine against an enemy whose best anti-tank weapon was the suicide bomber. The Philippines campaign killed over 300,000 Japanese soldiers, virtually eliminating organized resistance in the islands by March 1945. Manila's liberation cost 100,000 Filipino civilian lives as Japanese Marines fought to the death in the city, turning it into a close-quarters nightmare that rivaled Warsaw or Stalingrad in brutality. MacArthur's forces retook Corregidor with a paratrooper assault that was pure theater. The fortress had no strategic value anymore, but symbolically it represented American return and Japanese humiliation. By April 1945, MacArthur commanded over 1 million men across the Southwest Pacific, controlled bases from Australia to Luzon, and his air forces dominated the skies over the Philippines and beyond. The operation he'd built from nothing, with resources Washington considered inadequate, had reconquered 1,500 miles and eliminated Japanese offensive capability south of Japan itself. His forces prepared for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, training for the bloodiest campaign of the war, expected casualties in the millions. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August saved those lives and denied MacArthur's final campaign, but they validated his strategic argument. The Southwest Pacific route he'd fought for, the island-hopping advance Washington thought was secondary, had positioned American air forces within range of the home islands. B-29 bombers operating from captured air bases in the Philippines and Okinawa burned Japanese cities with incendiary raids that killed more civilians than the atomic weapons. The industrial base MacArthur had insisted could reach Japan through his route proved him correct. The final accounting of MacArthur's theater operations showed numbers that justified his confidence and vindicated his fury at inadequate support. His forces killed or captured over 400,000 Japanese troops, destroyed over 4,000 aircraft, sunk over 1,000 ships and small craft. American casualties were high, 62,000 killed, 206,000 wounded. But compared to the Japanese losses, compared to what a conventional campaign would have cost, the exchange ratio was devastating. MacArthur had fought his war with 15% of American resources and achieved results that equaled Nimitz's Central Pacific campaign in strategic impact. The doctrine MacArthur developed, bypass, isolate, advance under air cover, move faster than the enemy can react, became standard operating procedure for American offensives. The integration of air and ground power his forces pioneered, the use of vertical envelopment with paratroopers, the emphasis on logistics and engineering support enabling rapid advance, all became permanent features of American military doctrine. Even the political military coordination he forced on Washington, making strategic decisions based on moral obligations and political reality as much as pure military efficiency, shaped how America would fight future wars. Today, in the MacArthur Memorial Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, his command car sits preserved behind glass, the vehicle he used across the Philippines campaign, still bearing the mud from Luzon roads. The walls display maps showing his island-hopping campaign, red arrows arcing across the Pacific from Melbourne to Tokyo, each jump marked with dates and casualties. Visitors study the progression, the impossible distances covered, the speed of advance that seems fantastic even now. In a glass case near the main exhibit, a captured Japanese staff document from 1944 translates roughly, "We underestimated MacArthur's determination and overestimated Washington's control over him. He was given minimal resources and told to defend. Instead, he attacked, and his attack succeeded through methods we did not anticipate, bypassing strength, striking weakness, moving so rapidly that our reinforcement decisions were obsolete before we implemented them." We laugh at his theatricality, his speeches about returning. But he returned, and he brought an industrial and tactical capability we cannot match. The mistake was ours, not Washington's. Washington simply failed to support their general adequately. MacArthur made that irrelevant. The final line in MacArthur's Pacific campaign belongs not to him, but to the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who fought it, the infantry who marched through jungle until their boots dissolved, the pilots who flew until they fell asleep at the stick, the engineers who built airfields and swamps, the sailors who ran convoys through submarine-infested waters, all serving a commander who promised victory and delivered it against odds Washington thought impossible. They took the nothing he was given and forged it into a weapon that carved through the empire's southern defenses like fire through paper, proving that strategic vision and operational audacity could compensate for resources, that America's strength wasn't just industrial production, but the willingness to fight smarter when you couldn't fight bigger. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.